Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Queen's Indian defense, and we are going to cover the Miles variation of the Queen's Indian, which are the positions with bishop f4, developing the bishop outside of the pawn chain before playing e3 or e4, or playing knight c3, or as in some other Queen's Indian variations, defending the b4 square with a3. So the Miles variation is a very weird opening in comparison to other Queen's Indian defense positions we've been looking at. The first thing I'd like to say is that it's a great way for white to avoid mainline theory, to confuse the Queen's Indian player, and to definitely get him out of his comfort zone, because the game is not going to be a normal Queen's Indian. Most likely it's going to be something resembling a London system for white against the Queen's Indian defense setup for black, or it's going to be a bishop f4 Queen's Gambit declined, where black plays a Tartakower setup. So it's definitely not going to be a normal Queen's Indian in which black and white fight for the light squares in the center, for e4, for d5, where white plays for e4, where black plays for a kingside attack. So it's not going to be anything like that. The second thing I'd like to mention is that it's not the best way for white to play. It's easy for black to equalize, and in most variations black is equal or it's minus 0.1, so black should even be slightly better. However, it's hard for black to play against this because most players don't know how to. Before you get into this video, if you haven't seen the video on the London system against the Queen's Indian defense, maybe you should see that, because it's going to be quite similar. And it's going to help. So even if you don't play the London system, I would advise you to watch it. Okay, so let's get into the opening. So d4 by white, knight f6 by black, c4, e6. Black plays his flexible e6, inviting the Nimzo Indian. So white has a couple of options. White could play knight c3, allowing the Nimzo. White could play the Catalan, or white could play knight f3, in most cases allowing either the Queen's Gambit declined or the Queen's Indian defense. Sometimes after d5, white could still opt for the Catalan. Okay, and if black plays b6, there are normal moves here for white. The main line with g3, the Petrosian variation with a3, all other moves that we've been covering so far fight for light squared control in the center. The Queen's Indian is a modern hybrid opening which tries to fight for the center with pieces, and black will play bishop b7 to challenge the light squares. Black has a knight on f6 challenging the light squares. So black's task is to control the center with the pieces and then go for counterplay later on, which is why in most variations white tries to prevent that. So white will usually either play knight c3 at some point to contest e4, he will play g3, bishop g2 to contest e4, he will play a3 to prevent bishop b4, which then allows knight c3 without bishop b4, which controls e4. So white usually adapts a light squared strategy. The Miles variation, bishop f4, is the complete opposite. White simply ignores the light squares in the center and says you can have them. You can do whatever you want with the light squares in the center. I'm going to develop quickly. I'm going to get my pieces to the best possible squares, and I basically don't care what you do. That's why the Miles variation is good. You play your system. It's very like the London system, because you get this bishop outside of the pawn chain, but as opposed to many London system variations where black gets in the move d5, you've already challenged the center with c4, so you sort of get the best of both worlds. And if black is not well versed in the theory of the Miles variation, which is extremely likely, then you won't have a hard time having an advantage. So let's have a look at black's options. Okay, so after bishop f4, black can do a couple of things. He can try to break the center with c5 straight away. He could play bishop to b7. He could play bishop to a6. Let's just mention that bishop a6, as opposed to other mainline variations after, for example, white plays g3, is not as good here, because the main idea of bishop a6 is forcing white to defend the c4 pawn in an awkward way. So white either plays queen c2, queen b3, e3, knight d2, something awkward. Since the bishop has already been developed to f4, and since white really isn't fighting for e4, e3 is a perfectly fine move. You're not blocking in your bishop. Your position is perfect. So playing bishop a6 doesn't really make much sense. So that leaves us with two main options for black. Black could either play bishop e7, which is the main line and the most solid, or he could play bishop b4 check, trying to fight for control of the light squares with tempo. Let's have a look at bishop b7 is something we have to play first, sorry, and then after e3 black has the option to play bishop e7 or bishop b4. So both moves are okay. I think bishop e7 is a bit more solid. I don't see the bishop on b4 as such a useful move, but it's an okay move. So after bishop b4, white is forced to defend. You don't want to play king e2, you don't want to play queen d2, so you only have two options. You can cover with your f knight, you can cover with your b knight. Both moves are okay, both moves are playable. But playing knight f to d2 is by far more common. Why? Because you want your b1 knight to be able to go to c3, from where it would control d5 and e4. If you play, which we are going to see, if you play knight b to d2, then obviously your knight is not controlling d5 when it gets developed to c3, because it cannot go to c3. However, playing knight b to d2 is basically a London system setup. Bring this pawn back to c3 and it's a London system. So for anybody who's familiar with the London, this may be more playable. We are going to examine both moves in detail. The other option, bishop e7, is the main line for a reason. It basically plays a Tartakha or Queen's Gambit declined position after at some point black plays d5, and it's simply the most solid preparing to castle. Now you have a bishop on f4, so this bishop could be won with knight h5, which was previously impossible because of, for example, if knight h5 is played here, you could play bishop g5 and black would be forced to exchange bishops. But after bishop to e7, knight h5 is a threat. So you could play without your bishop pair, that's perfectly fine. White could play h3 here to save the bishop, or he could simply ignore that with knight to c3, which I think is better. So for example, knight c3, knight h5, bishop g3. When that bishop is taken, you're going to recapture with the h-pawn and have pressure along the h-file, which will make it harder for black to castle kingside. You could combine this strategy with playing the move queen to c2 and castles queenside, which is a very aggressive way to play. The other option of playing h3 is, well, strategically safer because you keep your bishop pair. We'll get to that as well. Okay, let's just briefly mention some sidelines that could happen on the board, which are extremely unlikely. As I said, knight h5 is met with bishop g5, so that's not a problem. Black could play the move g6, creating a ton of dark squared weaknesses, but I don't think that's a problem. You continue with knight c3, bishop to g7, bishop e2. You could also play bishop to d3, and in most positions you will, but not when there is a pawn on g6. Then it doesn't make much sense because your bishop is biting on granite. Unless you castle queenside and play h4, h5, undermining that, then bishop d3 doesn't make sense. So bishop e2 is the main move. Both sides castle, and this really isn't much for black. He created dark squared weaknesses, that don't really give him anything. So g6, even if it's played, don't be worried, just play normal chess. c5 on the other hand is very interesting, and this is black attempting to go into a Benoni type structure with the bishop on b7 already. So after d5, which white always plays in response to c5, and e takes d5, don't think that you're playing against the Benoni, because cd5 would be met with knight d5. You simply lose a pawn and you have to move your bishop. But there's a fun line here. After e takes d5, you play the move knight c3. And d4 wouldn't be good, it would just give the pawn back, so black tries to win the pawn. So d takes c4, and you continue with knight b5. This is the only trick you have to know in the c5 line. After knight b5, you're of course threatening knight c7, so black doesn't have time for d5 or d6 or a6 or anything like that. Black has to play knight a6, and you don't even have to take the pawn back after knight to a6, although that's the best move, you could try to provoke some weaknesses with knight d6 check, and after bishop takes. I'm not saying this is perfect, but you're stopping black from castling. And if he, for example, plays knight e4, and this is a position I've explored briefly, then you take with the bishop on c4, knight takes, queen takes, and it's still not that easy for black to develop. But okay. So there are some alternatives to bishop e7 or bishop b4 check, but you will not see them often. So let's look at the two main moves. Okay. After bishop b4 check, as I said, we have a choice. We can either play a London system type setup where we get our b knight to d2, which is strategically less sound, or we can play the main line, retreating our already developed knight to make sure we could get knight c3 in. Let's look at that first. So after knight f to d2, obviously you will have some issues developing your bishop because of the g2 pawn, so you have to be slightly careful about that. But what you do get are a couple of tempi on the bishop. So for example, after castles you play a3. The bishop doesn't really want to take, because that would help develop your queen or your knight. So the bishop goes back. Now you play knight c3. Now you have this great knight on c3 and the control over d5. Black plays d5, you exchange, knight takes, and bishop takes. And it's a very even position. As I said, black is playing a sort of Tartakower Queen's Gambit decline setup and doesn't really have that many problems, so black is basically equal. But you could spice things up here. If you want to play crazy, then I advise the move bishop d3. It's by no means good, according to the engines, because you give up a pawn, but after bishop takes g2, if he takes, then you play rook g1, and this could get really scary really quickly. For example, bishop h6. And after bishop f6, you could just get your queen into play with queen to g4. So this could be very scary for black. If, on the other hand, after bishop d3 he doesn't take, and he plays something like knight bd7, then you castle for free, and you manage to sort out the problem of your pawn. So I still like these positions for white, and I think knight f to d2 is a better move than knight b to d2, but black shouldn't have any issues. If you play knight b to d2, then you're obviously not giving yourself the option to play knight c3, but you don't have trouble on g2, so also playable. Castles, bishop to d3 is now a very natural move. The pawn is not on g6, and this is a London system. This is just a London system position. d5, castles, knight b to d7, and this you can see in the London against the Queen's Indian setup video. So cd5, knight d5, bishop to g3 saves the bishop, bishop to d6 trying to trade the bishop off, and again a perfectly even position in which white could have a slight edge because of the pressure along the c-file. So after, for example, rook c1, and let's say a trade here, black is the one who will have to be careful. So playing c5 very early on is a good idea. So for example, c5 here, just to get rid of your weakness. So you want to play c5 as black, make the pawn structure symmetrical. Okay, there's a pawn on g3, and this should be an even position. In this type of pawn structure, there really isn't much either side could play for. If anybody is better, I would say it's black, because he has better knights. Both bishops are really good, and as I said, should be equal. So after e3, bishop b4 is an easy way to equalize for black. White doesn't really play for an advantage, and if you play the Miles variation, then you simply have to accept that. But that's assuming black knows what he's doing. Okay, now let's have a look at bishop e7. After bishop b7, pawn to e3, bishop e7, where black simply ignores what white is doing and castles. So we have two options: knight c3 allowing him to win our bishop, or h3 saving the bishop. H3 is the main line, so let's look at knight c3 first. So if black doesn't take our bishop, if he doesn't play knight h5, we don't have to play h3. If we didn't play h3 on the previous move, we don't have to do it now. So if black plays something that's not a critical move, like c5, d5, or castles, Then you simply continue with bishop d3 and castles kingside. The critical line with knight h5, though, is of course met with bishop to g3. Now, black normally doesn't play d5 here. Black normally continues with d6 and try to play for c5, going for a kind of hedgehog setup, or a Scheveningen small center in the Sicilian. So after d6, white plays bishop to d3, he plays knight to d7, and this is a very much Sicilian-like structure in which sometimes black is going to break with c5, sometimes he's going to reinforce the center with c6. So for example, queen c2, g6, saving the h7 pawn, bishop e4. You can play c6 to prevent the trade of bishops. You can also trade, but the idea behind c6 is to eventually play d5. So for example, castles queenside, which is perfectly playable, and d5, and this again should be equal. Castles queenside is perfectly playable. You should take with a grain of salt, because if you exchange, then obviously you could be in trouble on the c file, but it's a way to play for a win. Okay, so after knight h5, what you can expect is a game in which if black doesn't take immediately, he's going to have to adjust his pieces and sort of prepare d5, or play with the pawn on d6 and play for c5. So it's not going to be hyper aggressive for black. He does get the bishop pair if he wants to, though. So if I'm advising something for players with black, I would say don't play knight h5, play something else and just play a normal game, leave the bishop b on f4. That, however, does save white a tempo, because white normally plays h3 in the main lines. But I just don't see an advantage from this exchange after castles. I just don't think black is better because of his bishop pair. I would say white is better because he has pressure on h7. Okay, now the other option, saving the bishop with pawn to h3, is the safer option. You keep your bishop pair, and this bishop is good. There's no doubt about that. Okay, black castles, we play knight to c3, and black plays the move d5. Now what black is going to try to do, he's going to try to break open the center, challenge white's control with c4 and d4, and then and only then develop the pieces and make this bishop powerful. This bishop is obviously better than the f1 bishop for the moment. Whenever black plays d5, you want to take it as white. You want to open up the c file and create a weakness on c7. Okay, so takes. Black doesn't take with the pawn, making his bishop bad. Black takes with the knight. Okay, knight takes, bishop takes. Okay, now again, your normal square for the bishop is bishop to d3, and we know what black is trying to do. If you are given time as white, you will play castles kingside, rook c1, and take on c7. So whenever the opportunity arises, black needs to break open the center with c5, and after dc5, you could take with the bishop, you could also take with the pawn. I think taking with the bishop is sounder. Again, we have a symmetrical pawn structure in which neither side could play for an advantage. So again, this is the reason why the Miles variation tends to be equal, very hard for white to play for an advantage. Okay, so let's sum this up. So against the Queen's Indian, there are a couple of ways to play, and one of them is the Miles variation with bishop f4. And if you play the Miles variation, you are avoiding the main line theory, you're avoiding Queen's Indian type setups. That's about it. If you don't know how to play against the main lines of the Queen's Indian, play the Miles variation. Even if you do, the Miles variation may be a good weapon to confuse black. Because once I remember when I first met bishop f4, I had no idea what to do. Because basically, white is ignoring what I'm doing, and he is not going to play e4. If I'm not preventing e4, what the hell am I doing? So that could be confusing. But as I said, if black knows what he is doing, you will be equal or slightly worse. Okay, see you tomorrow. Stay tuned for more chess. We are going to continue the series tomorrow, and let me know what you think. Any feedback is appreciated. Thanks very much for watching. Bye bye.